You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Brought to you by Kaishax, helping you deliver through volatility.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how's it going?
Doing great. Calling in from the home office, as you can see. For those who enjoy seeing my world map back there, enjoy it. It's only 5 weeks until my sojourn on the Synchro Sally voyage take me through Africa. So you're going to have a lot of different backgrounds.
I'm excited for you. Do you have any trips planned between now and then? I feel like 5 weeks is a long time for you to not go anywhere.
Oh, yes. I'm going to Lithuania and Latvia the next few days. Then I have a trip to Bahrain in the Middle East, and I have a few days in Germany. And
wow,
that's all squeezed into the 5 weeks where I need to prep as well.
Oh, gosh. Yeah, a little stressful, but equally fun.
Oh, yeah.
Well, let's get into it. Let's talk about rates. I'll share my screen here.
A couple of things to note on the Asia-Europe rates. As you can see here, we are sharing both how the spot rates are doing, but also the futures rate. Maybe you can talk Londi compared to last week as well, because there's a couple of elements that are worth noting here. First of all, yes, rates are continuing up. You see the tiny peak that we had a month and a half or so ago. That was the immediate reaction to the Hormuz crisis that quickly dissipated again because it doesn't really impact Asia-Europe all that much. But we now are on an upwards trend. And more to the point, if we look at the futures rates, we can actually see the future rate over a peak now has moved up compared to last week. And that means the market participants are expecting a stronger peak now than what they actually did just a week ago. You can then start to ask maybe why. I mean, as I think we have discussed on previous occasions, there's a shortage of solid real-time demand data, but we do know supply data. We know demand on Asia-Europe has been very strong for more than a year. And in terms of capacity, I was actually looking up some of the week-on-week capacity data from Sea Intelligence, and capacity injection on Asia-North Europe is actually exceedingly low. It's a little bit volatile if you look at weekly capacity data, so I tend to look at a 4-week rolling average of capacity. If you look at 4-week rolling up to basically now, here today, capacity injection on Asia-North Europe is only 2% compared to last year. That is not much of a capacity injection in an Asia-Europe trade, which tended to grow 5 to 8% year on year for more than the past year. So we seem to be heading into a peak season where capacity injection is relatively low. Are the carriers then reacting to that? They are. If we're looking at their plant deployment, that's what we have in the data as well, the plant deployments as they're known right now. We're seeing a 10% capacity injection over peak. That is still not much if we are going to continue to see this maybe up to 8% demand growth or so. So it seems that the strengthening both we are seeing now in Asia-Europe, but also the elevation of the expectation for the peak is driven by fundamentals. It is the overall supply demand in that market that's behind it.
Interesting. Maybe let's talk a little bit too about the Asia to US West Coast, US East Coast, where rates are at there.
A few things to note here. First of all, what has become a recurring topic, Northeast Asia to both the West Coast and East Coast, continue to show this almost sine curve fluctuating around the baselines being set by the rates out of Southeast Asia and China. That's simply a trend that continues. And we do have to conclude now, looking at data here for almost a year, that it has become a feature of the market that freight rates out of Northeast Asia on the Trans-Pacific, they are simply more volatile than China and Southeast Asia. And it does seem to lend support to the hypothesis that this is because the carriers are using Northeast Asia to shift capacity around to either allocate more or less, depending on what the market conditions are in other places of Asia. So Northeast Asia is to some degree subject to the developments in the other parts of the market rather than actually driving it. A few other notes now that we talked about capacity on Asia-North Europe. I actually looked at it on the Pacific trade as well. What we are basically seeing if we look Asia over to US West Coast, capacity injection was largely flat in Q1. And in Q1, this is also where we can see that rates actually began increasing. And the trend of increasing has been fairly consistent, unlike Asia-Europe, as we saw before, that was a little bit more volatile. And this consistent trend also seems to be driven by relatively low capacity injection year on year. Now, In the next coming weeks, we see an interesting phenomenon because now we're going to see capacity growth of around 20% year on year. And this goes actually both for West Coast and East Coast. That will only last a few weeks. And then capacity injection is planned at 3 to 5%. And if our listeners start to scratch their heads and say, what is going on? Are the carriers suddenly sending an armada of vessels just for the next few weeks? It's actually a year-on-year effect. Remember last year, this was when we were in the throes of the worst of the US-China tit-for-tat tariffs.
How could we forget?
Exactly. So this was when you had more than 100% tariffs on imports from China, which at the time meant that the carriers were canceling a lot of sailings rapidly because there was no cargo moving. So this massive year-on-year growth is actually not a growth in capacity at all. It's purely an effect of what we saw operationally last year during the trade war. So the trend remains very low capacity injection year on year overall in the Pacific, both the West Coast and East Coast as well, which means that this continued strengthening of freight rates is again rooted in fundamentals. It's supply and demand, and that goes for both Asia-Europe as well as for Trans-Pacific. It's supply and demand, augmented somewhat, of course, by increasing fuel prices, but not much effect as such from the Strait of Hormuz as compared to when the Red Sea happened, for example.
Yeah. Really interesting insight about the change year over year. It's very good to keep the context of what happened in the previous year in mind because you might have some surprising data otherwise.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, let's shift gears a little bit. We do have some breaking news. So could you talk us through what's going on right now?
Yeah, literally an hour before we started recording this, there was a news flash coming out of UKMTO, which is the main military news source from the Middle East, that there was a tanker vessel in the Gulf of Oman that suffers an explosion. They are not calling it an attack, but a vessel suffering an explosion, by the way, close to the waterline. It was external, close to the waterline. The crew is safe. Some bunker fuel is actually discharged into the sea. And whilst this is not a lot of information, it does match the phrasing and the way it usually is whenever they are reporting about vessel attacks. An early interpretation, keep in mind, that is my interpretation based only what we've seen so far. This could potentially be an Iranian retaliation. U.S. forces did do some bombing attacks around the port of Bandar Abbas earlier this morning, so this could be the Iranian response to that. All in all, we are left at the situation where the U.S. was conducting some limited strikes on Iran this morning. Now it seems Iran might have attacked a vessel. So the hopes of an imminent resolution to this seems to dissipate rapidly, unfortunately.
What has been going on over the last week before this happened?
Not a lot in reality over the past week. The past week has mainly been filled with speculations that there might have been an agreement coming, but every time they were sort of being dangled, it kept being postponed. We have seen more substantiated information that the Iranians have set up some sort of Hormuz Strait Gulf Council that you need to liaise with if you want your ships to go through. As has become norm in this conflict, there's very, very conflicting information in this case. Some Iranian parts are coming out with information saying that you have to pay to get through. There are other official sources in Iran saying that you don't have to pay to come through. It's the only thing that seems clear is you have to liaise with the Iranian military if you even want to have a chance of getting through. But I would take it that this is our willful informational mismatch. We need to keep in mind these are entities that are at war, they're negotiating, and launching different pieces of information which may or may not be true is also par for the course.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's probably worthwhile talking about what we're seeing in terms of the fuel costs that have changed very rapidly over the past few months.
Yeah. The day the crisis started, oil prices spiked, then they fell back a little bit, but bunker fuel has been relatively stable over these last 2.5 months or so at a much more elevated level. So I sat down and calculated, well, if we set a baseline matching the last 6 months prior to the crisis and look at where are we now, then of course you can see what is the added cost from the Hormuz crisis. You can take that into context of roughly how much bunker fuel does the entire container shipping industry burn. Now, mind you, I'm only looking at the container shipping industry. I'm not taking tankers or bulkers or anything else into account. If I look at container shipping alone, the added cost of fuel is around $5.5 billion for these past 3 months.
Wow.
And to put those $5.5 billion, it's good to put them into some sort of context. And quite a few of the lines have just announced their Q1 financial results. Now, of course, the last 3 months is not quite Q1, but at least it's a 3-month period as well. We also know not all lines publish results. MSC famously don't, for example. But if we look at the ones that do have results and simply assume they are representative for the rest of the industry that don't provide results. Keep in mind, the added fuel cost was $5.5 billion. The industry overall had revenues of around $67 billion. So $5.5 billion out of a revenue of $67 billion. That is a material added cost increase. Another even more interesting comparison, the industry overall had earnings at the EBIT level, so earnings before interest and tax, at $2.7 billion. So the added fuel cost over the last 3 months is twice the magnitude of the total EBIT of the industry in first quarter. So this also illustrates how vitally important it would be for the carriers to actually pass on these costs, because otherwise their own bottom lines are severely under threat.
Yeah. And we've spoken before about how the increase in rates is not matching what we're seeing with the increase in fuel costs.
Yeah, there was definitely a period where that was not the case. You can see with the increases we're beginning to see over the last couple of weeks, it seems the carriers are beginning to make up some of the lost ground. But it is clear this added fuel cost definitely exceeds the profits of the entire industry.
Yeah. And I think this is good to keep in mind because I feel like there's a perception post-COVID where container shipping had a high margin just because we saw these really high rates in the years post-COVID. But what we're seeing with the numbers that you're talking about here is that structurally, it's still the same industry. It's very volatile. It's very cost sensitive. So these are really important factors to keep in mind.
Yes.
It could be a make or break sort of situation.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about the Red Sea. So anything going on there? We tend to talk only about the Strait of Hormuz lately.
Yeah, I mean, we should still remember the Red Sea crisis is still going on in the sense, if we define the crisis as most of the carriers having to go around Africa. One tiny change was actually noted now. CGM, who, as I think everybody knows, have been operating some services that way through the risk area for the last year and a half, have now also scheduled one of the vessels on their FAL-1 service. That's an Asia-North Europe service. This is the first time they're sending any of their vessels on this specific service through. Should also be noted that this is one of the Ocean Alliance services, which of course means that if you're booking on any of the other Ocean Alliance carriers, COSCO, OOCL, Evergreen, your cargo might actually also go on this vessel that's going to take a head-haul route up through the Red Sea.
Interesting. So we've spent a lot of time talking about the Strait of Hormuz, but has there been much activity in terms of conflict in the Red Sea in the past few months?
Actually, there hasn't. That has perhaps been the largest surprise of this crisis. I mean, given the high level of activity of the Houthis earlier in the Red Sea crisis, there has been no attacks from the Houthis on shipping at all. The Houthis announced a ceasefire back in September last year. That was when there was a ceasefire also agreed between Gaza and Israel. They have been hard on rhetoric since, but they have not actually done anything related to shipping. They have lobbed a few missiles at Israel, but shooting at ships is not something we have seen. What we don't know is that because they've run out of ammunition? Or is it because they don't want to get involved? Or is it because there's simply no ships to shoot at? Because keep in mind, the Houthis all along have been fairly picky in who they actually shoot at. They've been very clear they're not shooting at everybody that goes through. We can also see that there's plenty of traffic going through, but they will shoot at ships that they deem to be associated with, say, US or Israel, and that's down to their interpretation, which also seems why most of the main container lines keep not going around, because they do service Israel, which in the eyes of the Houthis is sufficient of a reason to actually shoot at them.
Yeah. I'm very curious to see what happens from this point forward. If they have a successful journey, no issues, do you expect that they would then expand the service perhaps and have more vessels proceed to go through?
On the FAL-1, that could potentially be the case. And again, as we talked about earlier on the freight rates, there's not a lot of capacity injection. This is likely a good way of CMA CGM to increase the effective capacity a little bit on the Asia-North Europe trade, and therefore capitalize on what's expected to be a stronger peak season.
Right. Yeah. And just to remind our listeners, that's something that you've talked about a bunch. when the vessels are going around the Cape of Good Hope, you're losing a lot of that capacity with the extra transit time. So once we cut back through going the regular routing, you would be injecting additional capacity.
Yes.
Awesome. All right, well, we'll keep an eye on that. Something else that we wanted to discuss today was the U.S. consumer sentiment. Could you talk about the latest numbers?
Yeah, the University of Michigan has been providing the official U.S. consumer sentiment measurements ever since 1952. So it's a fairly long one. The last many decades, it was monthly. All the way back in 1952, it was quarterly data. And the latest measurement that came in here was quite literally the lowest reading ever since 1952. And there has been a lot of also downturns in the US since 1952 before we got to this date. So if we were to look at consumer sentiment alone, at least this is a concerning sign as to what will happen to consumer spending over in the US. We need to put it in context here. If you look at container shipping, there has been negative developments ever since the trade war started. So the trade war alone placed a negative focus on containerized movements. At the same time, during the trade war, we have seen consumer spending actually hold up very, very nicely in the US. It has not really suffered all that much. But a rapid deterioration in consumer sentiment, if that translates into consumers then suddenly also reining in spending, that could be problematic, especially for the Trans-Pacific trade.
Yeah. And I'm curious, Lars, from your perspective, could you talk a little bit about the relationship between consumer sentiment and freight demand, and maybe how it's changed over the years? Is there a direct relationship, and has it changed maybe post-COVID?
Very good question. It's one I don't have the answer to. It seems logical that there should be a relationship, but there's many things in the world that sounds logical and aren't when you then start to actually quantify it. It's an analysis I've just started to look at, so I don't have the answer, but I think we can probably promise all our listeners that next week when we're on the podcast, let's dive a bit deeper into and say, what do the numbers actually say here? What did we see? I mean, we have wild swings in consumer sentiment also over COVID. Is there actually a relation between that and the containerized movements?
Yeah. All right. Sounds good. I'll hold you to it. All right. So let's talk about reliability now. So we have some new data from Sea Intelligence.
Yeah, those are the April data. If we look at it from a global perspective, it was basically flatline, technically up a little bit. We see global reliability go from 62 to 62.4%. In the greater scheme of things, that's really flatlining. The one thing I was mainly interested in seeing is whether Gemini manages to improve again, because keep in mind, most of the time Gemini actually delivered on their 90% promise. Then we had 2 months where they faltered and went all the way down to 80%. They were blaming it on especially bad weather. What then happened here in the April measurements is they're now back up at 85%, so they're halfway on catching up. Given that development, my expectation would be, and let's discuss it in a month from now, that they're probably going to be back up on the 90%, back on track again in the next monthly measurements. So it seemed that it was a temporary trough that they fell into. And if we dive into some of the individual trades, we actually did see Gemini get a score of as much as 98.5% reliability on Asia-US West Coast. That is actually pretty good. Now, mind you, at the trade lane level here, what Sea Intelligence does is they tend to measure rolling 2-month windows. So this is actually over a 2-month rolling average that they performed this RI. That's to make sure they have enough measurement points so individual outliers don't really disturb it. Usually, the rule of thumb in the Trans-Pacific is that some of the smaller niche carriers tend to have higher performance than the alliance carriers. Notably, Matson is known in the market for a stable, high performance for many, many, many years. Curiously, in this new measurement, whereas Gemini, surprisingly, is all the way up at 98.5%, Matson is at 78.6%. Very unusual for Matson. Not quite sure operationally what went wrong. If we compare Gemini on the Trans-Pacific to the West Coast to the other alliance carriers, the nearest competitor was MSC at 76%. For some of the other non-alliance carriers, the smaller independent ones, we had Heidi Shipping coming in at 77% and Swire at 76.5%, just to give an indication. So this was actually an outstanding performance in this case by Gemini coming into US West Coast.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it. You know, what are some of the operational practices that are separating the top performers from some of the rest of the industry right now?
You can say, apart from the luck of the draw when it comes to weather, No, some of them, there are multiple different things that goes into operations. So one element is if you are in a terminal and the pressure is really on, which cargo operations do you prioritize? Do you prioritize your alliance services or something else? Where right from the get-go, one of the clear operational parameters for Gemini was, especially in the terminals they control, and most of those are controlled by APM terminals, was a clear prioritization of Gemini services. That definitely helps. That might then result in lower performance on some other services as a spillover effect, but that is one of the elements you can clearly do. Of course, then the other elements are down to, can you get a berthing slot? Again, if you control the terminal and your focus is on prioritization, the answer is yes. I would say that's definitely one of the key parameters. Of course, then you got other parameters. Do you want to speed up if you lose time? That is one of them. One of the other elements is, do you suddenly introduce an inducement call for whichever reason? There might be good reasons for doing that, but then you are then also causing a knock-on effect and delays further on down the line. That's a choice from the carriers, of course.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't think about the fact that they could just choose to go a little bit faster. It doesn't always seem like an option.
It doesn't always seem like an option, and you can say with oil prices now being where they are, I'm not sure any of them want to consider going faster because speeding up burns an enormous amount of fuel.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, well, one last topic today, unless you have any surprises for me. So the UK ETS, it's coming into force July 1st. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and what that means?
Yeah, ETS, first of all, for those not familiar with the acronym SOUP, is Emissions Trading Scheme. That doesn't really explain anything either. To maybe put it in more formal terms, this is the carbon tax, in this case on shipping. EU has had their carbon tax, their ETS in place now for quite a few years. The UK now gets their own ETS in place here from July. Initially, this only covers domestic UK shipments. That's it. So for the vast majority of our listeners here, unless you are feedering cargo to smaller outports in the UK, this doesn't really affect you. The reason why it's worthwhile looking at is there is already a proposal in the UK from 2028 to basically mirror the EU legislation. And in the EU, what you're doing is you are paying carbon taxes on the emissions from your last non-EU port. Well, actually half the emissions. And this has created a loophole that many of the carriers to some degree actually also use and have used for several years. If I ship from Shanghai to Rotterdam, I need to pay tax on my emissions on that journey. If I ship from Shanghai to Felixstowe, there is no tax to be paid because there is no UK ETS on foreign shipment.
Yet.
And then if I continue from Felixstowe to Rotterdam, I only need to pay emissions from Felixstowe to Rotterdam, which is a very, very tiny jump of 150 miles or so, which of course is a glaring loophole. You can see it in the way the carriers have also structured their services. I wouldn't say that they are abusing the system, that would be wrong, but they are clearly also recognizing at times it definitely does make sense to have a UK port either as the first port in or last port out when you're calling North Europe. If the UK then adopts that proposal, then that loophole will be closed from 2028, which means that all shippers in and out of the EU would face somewhat higher costs again.
Interesting. We talked about the vessel order book, and there's a lot of vessels that are expected to come onto the water in the next year or so. I was wondering if these vessels are already built in anticipation for these types of environmental regulations and the way that you would need to change up how you're consuming fuel considered when buying.
Absolutely. There was a study coming out from the World Shipping Council just a few weeks ago looking precisely at the order book. And off the top of my head, it's something like 70% of the order book is actually dual fuel vessels. Let me just see if I can just really double check the number. Let's say container shipping order book dual fuel, because we might be able to give everybody the right answer. Yeah, 78%.
Okay.
78% of container ship ordered by, they are actually dual fuel. So what the carriers have basically across the board concluded is they don't know the future, which is probably a very sensible conclusion. And when you don't know the future, you hedge your bets. In this case, you have a dual fuel capable. You can run a normal fuel. You can also switch over to gas or something else at some other point in time. It's not going to be as easy as just snapping your fingers and then you're just refueling with something else. There's probably a little bit of work that needs to be done. But it does show some good forethought on the side of the carriers, hedging their bets because we don't know what the fuel future will be, how quickly it will change, or what it will change into.
Yeah. It's interesting because we see a lot of the regulations more on the EU, UK side of things, not so much from the US side, like supporting that type of initiative. But I wonder if, because the infrastructure will begin to be there more, will it be easier to pass that type of thing in the future?
My expectation here is it's not going to be easier to pass. The great hope was the net zero framework, which was basically a global frame for taxing emissions on ships. I mean, that is on life support right now. Will it pass 6 months from now? Maybe. If it passes, it's likely going to be a somewhat watered down version that doesn't really drive much. I think the realistic path here is you're going to see different national or regional. EU already adopted the ETS because they didn't want to wait for the rest of the world. UK is now doing their own thing. There's a couple of countries in Africa that actually has their own thing too. For the life of me right now, I think Djibouti is one of them. There's also one over in West Africa. So I'm probably going to go by those countries over the next half year or so and can have a look at it. But I would expect more and more countries around the world to follow suit, but they will follow suit with legislation of their own because that's within their own control.
Yeah, a bit more piecemeal of a tactic
Yeah.
here.
It's one of these. In theory, yes, it's a lot more advantageous and easy if everybody can agree, but we just need to conclude on these matters. It's not just a discussion of whether everybody can agree on what to do about climate change. This one is also, can everybody agree on a common type of taxation? And can everybody agree on who then manages the money and what is the money used for? That's an element we often tend to forget, but that's also part of that discussion.
Yeah, that's a tougher question.
Yes.
I think everyone wants their hands in the pot, but, voting on who gets to do it, that's a tricky situation.
Yes.
All right. Interesting stuff. Lars, anything else you want to talk about today?
No, I think we covered all of it, but if anybody is listening to us in real time or near real time, keep an eye out for the Hormuz situation. Let us hope that this was a one-off in terms of yet another ship attack.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. We're on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music. If you haven't already filled out the survey that I've spoken about previously, please do so. If we're connected on LinkedIn, you'll see it on my post there. We're going to be closing that survey up soon. Thank you to everyone that's already participated, and we'll see you all next week. Bye, y'all.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by NiceX. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app.